book discussion, Beach Read by Emily Henry. Every now and then I discuss books that I read. This is one of those episodes. Just as a reminder, I do this for two reasons. One is I think it's good to have a record of my thoughts and interpretations of the books I read. And I think the second reason, and that this is really key for this podcast, the purpose of this podcast is to give people a sense for what it feels like to run a hedge fund. I've said on several occasions on this podcast that reading is conditioning of the mind, and therefore it's not just a nice to-do activity for running a hedge fund, but an absolutely crucial activity for running a hedge fund, because interpreting novels, thinking about novels in your way, finding a way to interpret a novel is very similar to finding a way to interpret pretty much anything. And this is really what the core is of the hedge fund business. So I urge people to take this seriously. And even if this particular book might not be, it's not a business book or a book about a founder who created a lot of wealth or any of that stuff. It is a book that nevertheless is relevant because it's a good novel, it's a solid novel, it's thought-provoking, inspiring, and therefore it's conditioning the mind. And this is what is so important when you're in the hedge fund business. This is the Not Even Wrong podcast. It's August 3rd, 2021. This is Krim Delco. For the day, the fund is up 4 basis points. The market is up 80 basis points. For the year, we are up 3.8%. The market's up 18.4%. We're underperforming by 14.6%. Let's get right into it. Emily Henry, Beach Read. I'm going to give my interpretation of the book. Actually, the author gives a reader's guide, so she gives her own interpretation or her own motivation for writing the book at the end of the book. So I'm going to discuss that also, but I'm going to give my interpretation. And like I said in the prelude here, what's important here is the interpretation, the act of interpreting the book. There's no right and wrong. I'm actually way off in terms of what I think this book is about relative to what the author is saying in the end of the book. So I'm going to discuss what she's saying. Also, whoever wants to skip the book and just go to the explanation for why the book was written, it's towards the end of the book. I recommend the book. It's a good book. I gave it a good rating. It's not the best story I've read, but it's very well written and it's witty, and I think it's thought-provoking, so it's worth reading. So like I always do, I'm going to interpret the book in a way that I'm not going to give anything away, of course. There is a plot here, there is a story, and I don't want to spoil anything. So in my view, this book is about the dichotomy of emotions and frontal cortex thinking. This is what I see in this book. Why is that? So there are two characters in this book, and those two characters are what we will call very intelligent, smart people. Smart in a conventional way. They're witty. They're very good with words. Their thinking is clear. They're articulate. They can say what they think. They think well. All these things that you would consider, let's say, a very good student in school, an English student in particular, but not just that, just very good at articulating things. So these people are, on the one hand, like I said, let's just call them very smart and witty people. On the other hand, there is the emotional characters. There's two people here, and those two people each have two characters. One is that smart, witty character, and then there's the other one, and I call it the emotional character. And that's the character that is sort of created out of their emotional fabric. And that character, in both cases, is totally confused, absolutely crazy. They don't know what they're doing. You sometimes think to yourself, what is this? How is this even possible? There is a tension in the book between this smart and witty personalities and then this emotional part, the romance part of their personalities, the falling in love part, the falling out of love part, the divorce and marriage and all that stuff. It is very much about people and how they deal with romance, how they deal with emotional situations in life, and how different that is from the frontal cortex. And I'm gonna give a little bit of a scientific viewpoint of this. The reason I interpret the book this way is also because I've been working on this within the context of Orange Capital Partners. I've been working on the idea in the context also of artificial intelligence. The questions: what is intelligence? What does it mean to be smart? These types of questions came up every now and then in my work. So when I read this book, I'm kind of already framed in terms of thinking of, like I said, frontal cortex thinking. Now, let me digress a little bit. So humans have this ability to channel their thoughts through the frontal cortex, and this is what we call logical thinking. In certain neurological circles, that is also called the CEO of the nervous system, which is the frontal cortex, the sort of the part of the brain that tells the rest of the nervous system what's up, or the CEO, so the boss. Now, the point is, and this is very important, we are, as humans, we have a very, very complex nervous system. And we have a lot of sensors. I've spoken about this before, also in David Eagleman's work, the sensory, the skin as a sensory object, ability to collect data from many different sources, smells, touches, things like that, the pressure of the air, all that stuff. And then we put that together in a model, and it goes to the frontal cortex. So what differentiates us from other sensory vehicles in the biological world is that we do have this frontal cortex. So we do have this ability to think logically, to have what we think is consciousness and will and purpose and all that stuff, which goes to the frontal cortex. But here's the but. We are illusioned in a way that we think that this is it. It's not it. There is a whole other part of us. There is this whole other sensory system and nervous system that we have. And in a nutshell, everything we have, everything we understand through the frontal cortex is what we call knowledge and understanding, and everything else we call emotions. So in Emily Henry's book, this dichotomy gets front page. This is what the book is about as far as I'm concerned. Because these characters, on the one hand, like I said, very witty, very, very good frontal cortex, all that stuff. But then the emotional part, complete disaster. Now there is a lot of romance in the book. The book's about love, about loss, about refinding love, all that stuff. It's all great. It's all good. But this, to me, is the key part of the book. And I think it's very important to understand this in the context of the question, what is intelligence? And this is, I'm making an arch now to the professional side of Orange Capital Partners. And this is part of this book reading. It makes you, you start thinking, you start going along the lines of one thought and then another thought, and you start collecting ideas, and you sometimes generate knowledge, sometimes you don't, but it is just so important. It's like conditioning of your brain. So I think that the question, what is intelligence? What is knowledge? I subscribe to the idea that intelligence is the ability to form models of the world and then make predictions. This is what intelligence is. And I think it's very crucial, and this book kind of alludes that, puts that on front page, is that we cannot just rely on the frontal cortex. We have to be able to incorporate our complete nervous system. Or in other words, if we can do that, we have a lot more information. It makes it more difficult to generate models. And these two characters in this book are very good examples of the confusion that this emotional part, this non-frontal cortex thinking part, if you want, that can create. However, still, it is very useful information. We as humans have evolved over millions of years from other species, but then as humans over tens of thousands of years, developing an ability to generate or to build models from the environment using our sensory system and using more than just the frontal cortex. In fact, the frontal cortex is only a small part of the game. This is the key to the answer, what is intelligence? This is one of the interpretations of the book. To me, again, it's a very interesting book. There's more to this. This is just my take, and I just want to sort of digress a little bit here and just explain. When I interpret a book, when I give, particularly in terms of an episode in this podcast, this is not my sort of attempt to be a book critic or my attempt to say this is what it is. By no means. In fact, what I'm trying to do here is, like, again, form my thoughts, develop ideas, take the inspiration from the reading, and then repurpose it into my own words and see what comes out. And I think in this case, something very interesting came out. The interesting part of what came out was that I realized that you can have very, very intelligent people, but also very different characters when it comes to the emotional side of things. By the way, we call that also emotional intelligence. We have words for that. And in this case, these people, they have enormous amounts of frontal cortex intelligence, but their emotional intelligence is all over the place. They end up in a good place. There's nothing wrong here. This is not a tragic novel. I can give that much away. There's no murder or any of that stuff. But we have this ability to generate models about reality and then make predictions. This is what we call intelligence. And it goes further. Why do we do that? In order to solve problems. How do I get from A to B? I generate a model from reality. I then make a prediction. I go from A to B. Now, before I end this episode, I want to just mention the author's interpretation of the book, or the reason she wrote the book, which she gives in the end of the book. She says this book is about writer's block. This book is about the inability to create and then what it takes to create. Now, I want to say two things about this. First and foremost, I can totally understand what that is. I've myself had a lot of writer's block. There's something called investor's block. As a hedge fund manager, you're often, because you start every day with a blank white piece of paper, and then you have to develop ideas. You have to generate ideas, and sometimes that's very difficult. So we have that same problem. And I've like in the book, there are certain catalysts which turn writer's block into creative energy, and I've had that many times also. Surfing, taking a walk with my partner, swimming, doing exercise, things like that can open up the floodgates for me. Other people are different, but it's just interesting how we work as humans, and that we find inspiration. Let's say, why does physical exercise make me more creative? Well, it does sometimes, and it's just an interesting observation. But more importantly, I want to talk about creativity a little bit. Creativity is something we don't quite understand. Creativity is something that, it's one of those frontier sciences. What is creativity? It's part of epistemology, and I don't think we understand it. Chiara Marletto's book that I discussed also on this podcast has spoken about this, and I think it's very clear that we are at the beginnings of the science of creativity, which is a good thing. I have my own thoughts about, like I just said, I have a certain definition of what creativity is, which is great. But it's kind of more of a descriptive, yeah, okay, fine, it's a model of the world, and then, I'm sorry, I was talking about intelligence. What is creativity? Before I go there, what is creativity? Well, creativity, in a nutshell, for me, is whatever we can program. That is creativity. Why? Because we don't understand the algorithm yet of how we get from A to B. How do we get from a blank piece of paper to a poem, a picture, a music piece? I think many people have asked themselves, how do you make a good, let's say, what is the secret of a pop song hit and all that stuff? That is creativity, because we can't answer. We don't know what it is. We don't know what creativity is, and I think that's we will probably know in 50, 100, 200 years. At some point, we will understand much better what creativity is. Chiara Marletto offers some clues. She starts with the concept of information. And the way I understand her view of creativity is actually very simple. She says, look, the more, she talks about a switch, 0, 1. That is information. any kind of switch which could have 0 and 1, the simplest form of information. It could be either 0 or 1. That's information. If I know it's always 1, then there's no information there because I know it's always 1. If I know it's always 0, there's no information there. I know it's always 0. But if I'm not sure if it's 0 and 1, then I can gather information by checking if it is 0 and 1. Now, creativity is simply if you have more of those switches. The more of those switches you have, the more probable outcomes you have, the more potential you have for new outcomes, and that's what we call creativity. And in Emily Henry's book, there is writer's block as a theme. So there is this inability to create. So in other words, an inability to connect those switches of 0 and 1 or those probable outcomes into something coherent that the frontal cortex can understand. That's really what writer's block is. And it takes sometimes energy from elsewhere to do that. It takes energy. And that's why we have this ability to unblock the writer's block by adding energy in form of physical exercise or the sun, or actually Emily talks about she gets creative every time the weather turns warm. So there is literally energy provided that helps people become more creative. And to end this episode, I just want to say that I believe that creativity is something that we at Orange Capital Partners, we will spend some more time thinking about. There is something there that we believe understanding creativity, at least conceptually, is going to help us exercise more freedom. Because it's very closely related. Creativity has to do with degrees of freedom. The more degrees of freedom you have, the more potential for creativity you have. The more potential for creativity you have, the more potential for wealth creation you have. And the mission of Orange Capital Partners is to generate wealth by investing in fundamentally new concepts and engineering practices with large impact. So if we can generate more creative outcomes by having more potential outcomes in a context of, in order to be creative, you have to have situations where there are more potential outcomes. So you're looking for situations where there is a lot of energy required to put the probable outcomes in a coherent way. That's where the creative part of investing takes place. If you invest in General Mills, there isn't much creativity there. It's pretty clear the outcomes. If you invest in something like General Electric, if you invest in JP Morgan, the potential outcomes are relatively small. So in other words, also the Monte Carlo simulation will have a very small range of probable outcomes. Tesla is the exact opposite. And actually, I have to applaud ARK Invest for that. They've used the Monte Carlo simulation and they've put on potential outcomes there that are almost ridiculous. But it shows you how creative that situation is. I want to stop here. I'm going to talk about this more in the future. I just want to summarize here Emily Henry's book, Beach Read. In my view, it's a book about the dichotomy of frontal cortex versus emotional thinking. In Emily Henry's words, the book is about writer's block. In any which way you look at it, it's an interesting book. It's a very inspiring book. And in terms of creativity and writer's block, I think it's an interesting inspiration as far as creative work is concerned, and the necessity to sometimes unblock the ability to find those pathways where creative situations can turn into successful outcomes. Thank you.